Good morning and welcome to this joint open banking webcast from KPMG, Kingwood Mallesons and Cuscal. I'm Bianca Bates, Chief Client Officer at Cuscal, and I'll be your moderator for today's webcast. Today we'll be discussing some of the key issues, considerations and opportunities your organisations and others would be thinking about in the lead up to open banking implementation and beyond. On the panel are Scott Farrell, Partner at Kingwood Mallesons, Ian Pollari, National Sector Leader, Banking and Global Co-Leader for the KPMG Fintech practice, and Nathan Churchward, Head of Product Emerging Services at Cuscal. At the end of the webcast, you'll have a better understanding of open banking and the opportunities which exist beyond compliance. If you have any questions that you'd like to submit, please click on the dark blue hand icon located at the top right of the platform. We'll aim to get to as many questions as we can during the webcast. So to kick off, I'd like to kick off by asking how significant the consumer data right will be at reshaping the relationship that exists between consumers and the financial services sector.
Well, thanks, Bianca. It is going to be fundamentally different, and this is a foundational change. And the reason for that is most people think of the financial services sector as being there to look after something really valuable to them, which is their money. But there is something else which is kept by the financial services sector and shared with the customer, which is information. Information shared between the customer and the sector. And just like with money, there needs to be a right of customers to be able to direct that information be shared with someone else they've chosen to trust, who's accredited to be trustworthy. And this will enable that to happen. But the fundamental thing that you need to ask is why? Why do we need to do this? It's not just because it's right, it's because it could make a difference to people's lives. Because it puts the customer in the centre. It gives them control. And control in relation to information about you is very important to real people. Also, it allows a greater choice in financial services, because one of the reasons that people can't find choice is because it's hard. The information is difficult to move around. It should also give them more convenience in managing their money. With all that paperwork, with all that complexity, most customers need someone to be on their side, and this is a way that someone can be on their side. And lastly, it should provide customers with more confidence in sharing information with the financial services sector, because there will be a framework of rules which is designed to protect them and look after them. There'll be safeguards, there'll be clear liability protection, there'll be regulators looking after them, watching them, and making sure that everything is done as they have requested. So in an age where the relationship between customers and the financial services sector is sometimes uncertain and volatile, this provides another base for customers to have control of that relationship and make it work for them.
And maybe just to extend that, I mean, clearly the legislative instrument is the consumer data right, which means that this will apply multi-sector. So just as you pointed out, Scott, from a financial services standpoint, the benefits will be realised in banking to start, but obviously have been designed with an ability to deploy this across the economy, with energy consultation starting and other sectors to follow as well. So this is something that certainly is important for corporate institutional clients of the banks to understand that this will also impact them at some point in time as the consumer data right applies to their sectors.
Yeah, that's right, because I don't think many Australian customers think that here is my banking information and here is my energy information and here is my telco information. They just think, here is my information. And so if they're going to have control over the way that's shared, it really can't be limited to a single sector.
Thanks, Ian and Scott. I'm just going to talk a little bit now about learnings from overseas. As we look towards open banking implementation, are there any learnings that we can take from open banking data regimes overseas? And are there any use cases that jump out as being particularly relevant or useful for Australia?
Well, thanks, Bianca. I might start with that. Certainly we're seeing the world move to what we call open banking or open data. at different stages, and clearly the objectives of government policymakers is a little bit different. Some are clearly looking at issues of competition, others are looking at consumer interests, others are looking at financial inclusion as objectives of introducing open data. How that's being delivered is also different in jurisdictions, in some mandating the use of APIs as a safe way to transfer data between banks and other financial institutions, whereas others are being more open and less prescriptive on mechanisms. The UK, Europe has clearly been, in a more contemporary context, I guess the early movers, having gone live with open banking and PSD2 last year. In terms of the lessons learned, I think it's important from a compliance perspective, and I know that in the opening you made the comment around not seeing this just simply as a compliance exercise. Getting to a compliance state and being operationally ready is not without challenges, and so recognising that early is important. We did have the situation in the UK where 4 of the 9 banks that are subject to the CMA open banking regime were ready, the rest weren't, and equally for some of the third-party providers, that many of them weren't ready for day one as well. So I think we need to understand some of the challenges in getting to compliance state, and clearly we're doing that in an environment where we're working with draft rules and some definitions still to come, so there's some complexity in being able to do that. In terms of the use cases, there's clearly some obvious ones that are perhaps more rear-view mirror, as I call it, helping consumers understand where they may have spent money, and when I say consumers, also businesses as well that will have the opportunity to use open banking services. But understanding the financial position, using that to better inform financial decisions, either through basic goal setting or personal financial management tools. The ability to aggregate the financial position across multiple providers is a use case that we see as a foundational one. And then I guess as consumers and financial institutions become, I think, clearer on the path to sort of greater value, and I think this will be an important one, the less we talk about open banking and more about the value to customers, the better we'll all be. But then starting to think about services that are more personalised, that are more context relevant, and then enable a consumer to instruct a particular provider to act on their behalf or to enable the consumer to do so in a self-service context. We think where more of the value-adding use cases will be. From an SME perspective, the research we've done suggests that there is a growing proportion of SMEs that would be open to using open banking services. We've seen some of those emerge in the UK where third-party providers such as the alternative lending platforms have been able to register and also then use their accreditation to be able to get access to, let's say, 5 years of transactional history to be able to help onboard or underwrite credit for a particular small business. So we think some of those ones are important because they'll start to get businesses and consumers engaged with the services that can come from open banking.
Great. So as financial services organisations prepare for open banking, what should they be considering as part of their strategy?
Well, coming back maybe to the point around compliance, I think is not sort of over or underestimating rather what's required to be compliant day one. And there will be new components that need to be developed. Banks and FIs will be at different stages of developing components, and whether that's sharing of data, ingesting data, managing consent, entitlement, understanding how to digitally identify or verify an individual is who they are, the management of APIs. And again, there's a continuum of different capabilities from use of internal APIs to then exposing APIs potentially for corporate institutional clients. So recognising the challenges in those components and also recognising that these don't all need to be built by every organisation, that there are providers both here and offshore that can help provide the sort of capabilities that will be necessary to comply. Beyond compliance is then looking at where are there opportunities to extend beyond existing product and services. And then I think ultimately the real commercial value, I think, will come through data partnerships that will emerge between not just banks, but organisations outside of banking, again, with the caveat that we're clear on what the market opportunity is, what consumer problem can be solved, and can only be solved by bringing data sets across different sectors to be able to do so.
Can I just one point in relation to your strategy is it's really important to take care before just taking a strategy off the shelf from another country. Because of what Ian has said, they are actually quite different. And so a strategy that has been adopted by someone in Europe and the United Kingdom won't necessarily work under the much broader regime because of the differences in the system. So what Ian has described is the strategies you take to be part of an economy-wide consumer data right, not part of a payment system addition that is taken in another country just to assist with payments. And so that is fundamental, is you actually need some creative thinking and some new thinking to make this work under the Australian system, because it isn't the European system and British system Mark II.
In fact, that was something I was at Money 2020 last week in Singapore, and the focus was much more broad than just payments. It was really enlightening to see how many financial institutions of all sizes are looking at those data partnerships, are looking at leveraging capability, but again, the story came through every single time that it needs to be localised, and it needs to be focused on the value proposition that your customers are looking for, not just what is an individual financial institution. So I think that Australia is in a good position because we have some very large financial institutions that have great capabilities, but the smaller ones are often already working together with partners, so we have the foundation set ready to go.
And another point of the strategy is to keep in mind the reciprocity built into the Australian system as well. So in choosing to be part of the system, you must also respond to a customer's request to share data. You can't just receive data without being subject to your own customer's request for data. And that forms a critical part of a strategy, because this is not a system where you get to just take. You need to give as well at your customer's direction.
So just back to the capabilities that are required for open banking and rolling out open banking. Nathan, I'm keen to get your views on how financial service organisations in the first instance should go about building and managing the capabilities required for open banking.
Well, I know that our clients are working with their core banking systems to ensure that the capabilities and the data strategies are in place. And then laying on top of that is consent and digital identity. Working with partners, though, I think consent is something that, from every conversation we've had with clients, it's a very complex problem to solve, and it's something that looks very primed to be delivered through utility and other models. So we'll work with a number of our clients to investigate those over coming months, as we know many others in the industry are looking at. Beyond that, digital identity will be a key enabler of ensuring the integrity and breadth of access. It also will open up capabilities across not just banking, but how we align with the other industries that come under the consumer data right. And again, that's another area that needs to be worked through, and the Australian Payments Council is working with the Australian Payments Network to look at opportunities to how we'd have a single framework that works across all financial institutions.
I mean, I think from a consumer perspective, it also stands to reason that, consent management or even digital identity and validating, you are who you say you are, and being able to do that. I think, we will see a lot of benefit in being able to consolidate the provision of those services. And again, if we look at it through the lens of, let's say, 3 to 4 years out, and the consumer data right now applies not just to banking, but energy, telecommunications and other sectors, I think it stands to reason that consumers won't want to be managing those in a disparate fashion. There'll be value in being able to aggregate that for a consumer, to give them a mechanism to understand who they'd granted rights to their data, for what purpose, for what period of time, and at some point in the future, the right to revoke that and ensure that that's been done as well. So from a consumer perspective, I think we'll also see the rise of mechanisms to simplify that experience from their standpoint as well.
And that's a fundamental part of the need for convenience to be delivered to customers. You're quite right, Ian. It's not the customer's problem And it can't be the customer's problem that they have to keep identifying themselves with different passwords to different people to use an holistic consumer data right. And it doesn't even have to come with the label of digital identity. It should just come with the label as, this is how I show you who I am. That will be what's important for Australian customers. But the complexity under the bonnet is significant. Apart from the fact that sometimes people might give conflicting consents to people. I want you to use this information in this way. And under the system, the consents have to be really quite clear, much clearer than 24, 28 pages of a legal contract. They've got to be 1 or 2 mobile phone screen pages and use real words that real people understand, which means there could be conflicts where someone says, I want to use it for this, but then the same data is shared with someone else, I want to use it for that. The customer interface needs to be really quite clear because it's not the customer's problem, but underneath the hood, a really complex and clever mechanism is required. And there's a huge opportunity for people that want to be participants in the Australian data sector to provide that convenience for customers.
I think this is an opportunity for banks and other traditional competitors to collaborate for the good of their customer, because if we have too many differences in the way that they do that, and we know that so many customers are multi-banked, it will drive confusion. So that's a key opportunity to put customer first before some of our own end outcomes.
We've talked quite a bit about banks and financial organisations, but can we now move on to FinTechs? I'm keen to understand how you think FinTechs can participate in open banking and what requirements or standards will they need to work to in order to take part in open banking and open data.
Well, yeah, I guess just starting with the requirements, and they're just draft rules at this stage, but again, informative in the context of what will be required. Clearly, some strong dimensions there around, being able to demonstrate fit and proper. The second dimension was around ensuring that they have adequate processes, systems and controls in place around not just CDR data, but information more broadly. Requirements around insurance and guarantees are all components that will need to be provided in order for a third-party provider, whether it's a FinTech or someone else, to be granted accreditation. And we think that that's a really important element around some of the safeguards and the way this has been designed. I think Scott also mentioned the notion of, as data recipients, there comes a set of obligations around being able to share data. And again, there'll be a spectrum of to what extent that will occur. Some of that may come through partnering with other organisations that can provide access to the CDR or the open banking regime, and others that we'll see FinTech companies that are looking to disrupt and no doubt will be looking to develop new services on the back of what that will allow. I think there'll also be a category of FinTech that will see this as opportunity because they describe themselves as enablers. They have some of the componentry that we spoke about earlier on, whether that is around consent or identity verification, or it could be around managing APIs. They're all elements that need to be solved for by data holders in the first instance. And so there's a great opportunity for FinTech companies to be participating in helping some of the banking industry participants in complying and also realising some of the opportunities. And we're starting to see that already with a number of UK FinTech companies also coming here with capabilities that they want to provide to the local banking industry.
And there's an important point there, and you could ask the question if you were a FinTech, just seeing for the first time, is why is all that there? And the reason is because you're part of an ecosystem. This is not about any individual entity. In fact, I'd be surprised if any individual entity could do all of this themselves. But if you want to be part of the ecosystem, then everyone is relying on you, just like you're relying on everyone else. And that feeds into why all of those requirements are necessary.
So if we look beyond compliance, what do you see as the future state beyond compliance from an open banking perspective for financial organisations but also consumers?
I think the value will be in solving complexity and creating solutions that simplify customers' lives and give them better choices. So that will be whether it's around payment, bill payment management, looking at forecasting of their financial position, and also coming into ensuring that when you're applying for services, that they are much easier and that there's less barrier to those options.
And I think building on that, I mean, there's almost an obsession with looking at the UK and, looking for signs of any discernible share of customers changing from one bank to the other, and it's really too early. And just as some banks will be looking at this as an opportunity to acquire new customers, I think it's also important for them to look at mechanisms by which they could be enhancing what they're delivering today by virtue of open banking. Some of that will lead to efficiencies, some of that will lead to an improvement in being able to understand and mitigate risks. And so I think that in the spectrum of value, it's not just about revenue and customer acquisition, it is also around efficiency and resilience and also the ability to better manage risks as well.
And I think you could even go even further and say that there is a huge opportunity beyond your core services in financial services. And financial services entities or people connected with financial services do have an advantage because the data sector is being created in a similar way to the financial services sector. So that means that the roles that people perform in financial services will also be needed for the flow of data as well, such as safe custodians, such as people to help with advice, all sorts of issues which people who understand financial services will able to be engaged in if they would just take the word money out of their business model and put the word data in. Then there are incredible opportunities to serve customers in this other sector, the data sector, which is the one which is created out of this framework. And that's really quite an important opportunity, way beyond compliance.
Sounds like a great opportunity for organisations to really build trust with their customers.
And the only thing I would add as well, that just coming back to the UK and the reality of the implementation challenge, given the tight timelines, was such that, notwithstanding the CMA 9 banks may have looked for commercial gain in open banking, but very much then turned their attention to getting to compliance state early, that there is a risk that we look at this as a compliance exercise, which means that it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that everyone is gearing their minds to compliance and not appropriately turning their attention to an ability to deliver a better value proposition to customers, let's say around core products and services, but extending beyond that to include adjacent areas of value or new services, as Scott alluded to.
Great. So speaking around timeline, the current timeline sees the major 4 banks having to make the first set of data available by February next year, February 2020. Are there opportunities for other banks to take advantage of being ready early? And what considerations should they be aware of?
The reciprocity that Scott mentioned earlier is very critical to that. So if other banks do want to come in early, and I know there are some that are looking at that, they're factoring in the fact that they have to expose their data for their customers and for those that want to receive it. So, but after that, everyone has to be ready by July, which is not that far afterwards. So moving late or moving early, we're really looking at 2020 is the year to move anyway.
Okay, so I'm now going to open up to some of the questions that have come through from the webcast. First of all, I've got a question from Perpetual for the panel. What are the biggest risks to the success of open banking in Australia?
So this is a risk for every single system that carries something important. And that risk is there's got to be confidence in the security. And that security is data security as well as privacy. And so the system has been designed to have layers of protection around security and privacy. And it is really important to understand that that is more than just at the one person level. It has to be the system as a whole that needs to be protected in that way. And that is really important that risk is managed, and a great deal of the work has been focused on ensuring that is managed. In addition to that, there is a question of education, which I think, Ian, you probably have a better handle on than I do.
Yeah, look, and I think that, again, looking at overseas experiences, I know that many players that have looked at the UK and other markets know that this is a really important step in success is education and raising awareness levels both of consumers and at small businesses. And I think in the UK, research showed that there's only about 25 or 30% of consumers that actually had heard or understood what open banking was. There was certainly a higher proportion of organisations in the SME sector that were aware. What was interesting in some of that further research of the business segment was also a large proportion, so more than 50%, said they would be willing to pay for services. So, for me, the real opportunity is how we early engage with that task of communicating, educating. That education needs to be around appropriate use, risks, but also about what sort of opportunities could be realised through the consumer data rights starting in banking. The other dimension, which Scott touched on before, which I think is a useful starting point, is making sure in that communication that consumers understand it's sharing information that they already share with their financial institutions. That is a really sensible starting point to commence that education, awareness, and then engagement with consumers.
So the next question comes from CBA. What are the key focus areas for open banking? Are they the same for incumbent and challenger banks, or are they different?
Well, I think if we consider that it's the consumer data right and the customer comes first in this, that the considerations are probably the same. Perhaps the directions that incumbents and challengers come to that requirement is different, but I think some of the smaller and challenger banks have built up their proposition around putting the customer first and doing what's good for the customers. So in some respects, they may have a good starting point, but all of them will actually look, what does their client need? What does their customer want from them as the holder of the data and the opportunities that they have to make their lives simpler and more secure and trustful.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, there are a lot of the component parts that provide for compliance and operational readiness, which will be the same. And then the use cases, again, I think some of the foundational ones around account aggregation, transaction categorisation, allow spend analysis, we would expect to be very common across both incumbents and challenger banks. I think what will also be interesting, given that we're now in a sort of post-Royal Commission inquiry, is also around the ability to use open banking to help validate and verify income and expenses, which is an important point regardless of your position in the banking industry.
Okay, so we've got time for one more speed question. In your research, and this is a question from NAB, in your research, has any country truly got their minds around consent?
Not yet.
And I think that's an opportunity that we've got. If we're looking at our system is around data, not just payments, is that to get our heads around that first and set the agenda as we have in some other areas.
So we've rapidly approached the end of this webcast. Unfortunately, we've been unable to get to all of the questions submitted. If you have submitted a question, we'll contact you individually with a response. In the meantime, I'd like to thank the panel, Ian, Scott and Nathan. Thank you for your time today. Hopefully you found the webcast informative and helpful as we move towards an always-on and open data economy enabled through the consumer data right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Bianca.